Paper 62. The Dawn Races of Early Man. About 1 million years ago, the immediate ancestors of mankind made their appearance by 3 successive and sudden mutations stemming from early stock of the lemur type of placental mammal. The dominant factors of these early lemurs were derived from the Western or later American group of the evolving life plasm. But before establishing the direct line of human ancestry, this strain was reinforced by contributions from the central life implantation evolved in Africa. The Eastern life group contributed little or nothing to the actual production of the human species. 1. The early lemur types. The early lemurs concerned in the ancestry of the human species were not directly related to the pre-existent tribes of gibbons and apes then living in Eurasia and northern Africa, whose progeny have survived to the present time. Neither were they the offspring of the modern type of lemur, though springing from an ancestor common to both but long since extinct. While these early lemurs evolved in the Western Hemisphere, the establishment of the direct mammalian ancestry of mankind took place in southwestern Asia, in the original area of the central life implantation but on the borders of the eastern regions. Several million years ago, the North American type lemurs had migrated westward over the Bering Land Bridge and had slowly made their way southwestward along the Asiatic coast. These migrating tribes finally reached the salubrious region lying between the then expanded Mediterranean Sea and the elevating mountainous regions of the Indian Peninsula. In these lands to the west of India, they united with other and favorable strains, thus establishing the ancestry of the human race. With the passing of time, the seacoast of India southwest of the mountains gradually submerged, completely isolating the life of this region. There was no avenue of approach to or escape from this Mesopotamian or Persian peninsula except to the north, and that was repeatedly cut off by the southern invasions of the glaciers. And it was in this then almost paradisiacal area, and from the superior descendants of this lemur type of mammal, that there sprang 2 great groups, the simian tribes of modern times and the present-day human species. 2. The dawn mammals. A little more than 1 million years ago, the Mesopotamian dawn mammals, the direct descendants of the North American lemur type of placental mammal, suddenly appeared. They were active little creatures, almost 3 feet tall, and while they did not habitually walk on their hind legs, they could easily stand erect. They were hairy and agile and chattered in monkey-like fashion, but unlike the simian tribes, they were flesh-eaters. They had a primitive opposable thumb as well as a highly useful grasping big toe. From this point onward, the pre-human species successively developed the opposable thumb while they progressively lost the grasping power of the great toe. The later ape tribes retained the grasping big toe, but never developed the human type of thumb. These dawn mammals attained full growth when 3 or 4 years of age, having a potential lifespan on the average of about 20 years. As a rule, offspring were born singly, although twins were occasional. The members of this new species had the largest brains for their size of any animal that had theretofore existed on Earth. They experienced many of the emotions and shared numerous instincts which later characterized primitive man, being highly curious and exhibiting considerable elation when successful at any undertaking. Food, hunger, and sex craving were well developed, and a definite sex selection was manifested in a crude form of courtship and choice of mates. They would fight fiercely in defense of their kindred and were quite tender in family associations, possessing a sense of self-abasement bordering on shame and remorse. They were very affectionate and touchingly loyal to their mates, but if circumstances separated them, they would choose new partners. Being small of stature and having keen minds to realize the dangers of their forest habitat, they developed an extraordinary fear which led to those wise precautionary measures that so enormously contributed to survival, such as their construction of crude shelters in the high treetops, which eliminated many of the perils of ground life. The beginning of the fear tendencies of mankind more specifically dates from these days. These dawn mammals developed more of a tribal spirit than had ever been previously exhibited. They were, indeed, highly gregarious, but nevertheless exceedingly pugnacious when in any way disturbed in the ordinary pursuit of their routine life, and they displayed fiery tempers when their anger was fully aroused. Their bellicose natures, however, served a good purpose. Superior groups did not hesitate to make war on their inferior neighbors, and thus, by selective survival, the species was progressively improved. They very soon dominated the life of the smaller creatures of this region, and very few of the older non-carnivorous monkey-like tribes survived. These aggressive little animals multiplied and spread over the Mesopotamian peninsula for more than 1,000 years, constantly improving in physical type and general intelligence. And it was just 70 generations after this new tribe had taken origin from the highest type of lemur ancestor that the next epoch-making development occurred, the sudden differentiation of the ancestors of the next vital step in the evolution of human beings on Urantia. 3. The mid-mammals. Early in the career of the dawn mammals, in the treetop abode of a superior pair of these agile creatures, twins were born, one male and one female. Compared with their ancestors, they were really handsome little creatures. They had little hair on their bodies, but this was no disability as they lived in a warm and equable climate. These children grew to be a little over 4 feet in height. They were in every way larger than their parents, having longer legs and shorter arms. They had almost perfectly opposable thumbs, just about as well adapted for diversified work as the present human thumb. They walked upright, having feet almost as well suited for walking as those of the later human races. Their brains were inferior to and smaller than those of human beings, but very superior to and comparatively much larger than those of their ancestors. The twins early displayed superior intelligence and were soon recognized as the heads of the whole tribe of dawn mammals, really instituting a primitive form of social organization and a crude economic division of labor. This brother and sister mated and soon enjoyed the society of 21 children much like themselves, all more than 4 feet tall and in every way superior to the ancestral species. This new group formed the nucleus of the mid-mammals. When the numbers of this new and superior group grew great, relentless war, broke out. And when the terrible struggle was over, not a single individual of the pre-existent and ancestral race of dawn mammals remained alive. The less numerous but more powerful and intelligent offshoot of the species had survived at the expense of their ancestors. And now, for almost 15,000 years, 600 generations, this creature became the terror of this part of the world. All of the great and vicious animals of former times had perished. The large beasts native to these regions were not carnivorous, and the larger species of the cat family, lions and tigers, had not yet invaded this peculiarly sheltered nook of the earth's surface. Therefore did these mid-mammals wax valiant and subdue the whole of their corner of creation. Compared with the ancestral species, the mid-mammals were an improvement in every way. Even their potential lifespan was longer, being about 25 years. A number of rudimentary human traits appeared in this new species. In addition to the innate propensities exhibited by their ancestors, these mid-mammals were capable of showing disgust in certain repulsive situations. They further possessed a well-defined hoarding instinct. they would hide food for subsequent use and were greatly given to the collection of smooth round pebbles and certain types of round stones suitable for defensive and offensive ammunition. These mid-mammals were the first to exhibit a definite construction propensity, as shown in their rivalry in the building of both treetop homes and their many tunneled subterranean retreats. They were the first species of mammals ever to provide for safety in both arboreal and underground shelters. They largely forsook the trees as places of abode, living on the ground during the day and sleeping in the treetops at night. As time passed, the natural increase in numbers eventually resulted in serious food competition and sex rivalry, all of which culminated in a series of internecine battles that nearly destroyed the entire species. These struggles continued until only one group of less than 100 individuals was left alive. But peace once more prevailed, and this lone surviving tribe built anew its treetop bedrooms and once again resumed a normal and semi-peaceful existence. You can hardly realize by what narrow margins your pre-human ancestors missed extinction from time to time. Had the ancestral frog of all humanity jumped 2 inches less on a certain occasion, the whole course of evolution would have been markedly changed. The immediate lemur-like mother of the dawn mammal species escaped death no less than 5 times by mere hair-breadth margins before she gave birth to the father of the new and higher mammalian order. But the closest call of all was when lightning struck the tree in which the prospective mother of the primate's twins was sleeping. Both of these mid-mammal parents were severely shocked and badly burned. 3 of their 7 children were killed by this bolt from the skies. These evolving animals were almost superstitious. This couple whose treetop home had been struck were really the leaders of the more progressive group of the mid-mammal species, and following their example, more than half the tribe, embracing the more intelligent families, moved about 2 miles away from this locality and began the construction of new treetop abodes and new ground shelters, their transient retreats in time of sudden danger. Soon after the completion of their home, this couple, veterans of so many struggles, found themselves the proud parents of twins, the most interesting and important animals ever to have been born into the world up to that time, for they were the first of the new species of primates, constituting the next vital step in pre-human evolution. Contemporaneously with the birth of these primates' twins, another couple, a peculiarly retarded male and female of the mid-mammal tribe, a couple that were both mentally and physically inferior, also gave birth to twins. These twins, one male and one female, were indifferent to conquest. They were concerned only with obtaining food, and since they would not eat flesh, soon lost all interest in seeking prey. These retarded twins became the founders of the modern simian tribes. Their descendants sought the warmer southern regions with their mild climates and an abundance of tropical fruits, where they have continued much as of that day except for those branches which mated with the earlier types of gibbons and apes and have greatly deteriorated in consequence. And so it may be readily seen that man and the ape are related only in that they sprang from the mid-mammals, a tribe in which there occurred the contemporaneous birth and subsequent segregation of 2 pairs of twins, the inferior pair destined to produce the modern types of monkey, baboon, chimpanzee, and gorilla, the superior pair destined to continue the line of ascent which evolved into man himself. Modern man and the simians did spring from the same tribe and species, but not from the same parents. Man's ancestors are descended from the superior strains of the selected remnant of this mid-mammal tribe, whereas the modern simians, excepting certain pre-existent types of lemurs, gibbons, apes, and other monkey-like creatures, are the descendants of the most inferior couple of this mid-mammal group, a couple who only survived by hiding themselves in a subterranean food storage retreat for more than 2 weeks during the last fierce battle of their tribe, emerging only after the hostilities were well over. 4. The primates. Going back to the birth of the superior twins, one male and one female, to the 2 leading members of the mid-mammal tribe. These animal babies were of an unusual order. They had still less hair on their bodies than their parents and, when very young, insisted on walking upright. Their ancestors had always learned to walk on their hind legs, but these primates' twins stood erect from the beginning. They attained a height of over 5 feet, and their heads grew larger in comparison with others among the tribe. While early learning to communicate with each other by means of signs and sounds, they were never able to make their people understand these new symbols. When about 14 years of age, they fled from the tribe, going west to raise their family and establish the new species of primates. And these new creatures are very properly denominated primates, since they were the direct and immediate animal ancestors of the human family itself. Thus it was that the primates came to occupy a region on the west coast of the Mesopotamian peninsula as it then projected into the southern sea, while the less intelligent and closely related tribes lived around the peninsula point and up the eastern shoreline. The primates were more human and less animal than their mid-mammal predecessors. The skeletal proportions of this new species were very similar to those of the primitive human races. The human type of hand and foot had fully developed, and these creatures could walk and even run as well as any of their later-day human descendants. They largely abandoned tree life, though continuing to resort to the treetops as a safety measure at night, for like their earlier ancestors, they were greatly subject to fear. The increased use of their hands did much to develop inherent brain power, but they did not yet possess minds that could really be called human. Although in emotional nature the primates differed little from their forebears, they exhibited more of a human trend in all of their propensities. They were indeed splendid and superior animals, reaching maturity at about 10 years of age and having a natural lifespan of about 40 years. That is, they might have lived that long had they died natural deaths, but in those early days, very few animals ever died a natural death. The struggle for existence was altogether too intense. And now, after almost 900 generations of development, covering about 21,000 years from the origin of the dawn mammals, the primates suddenly gave birth to 2 remarkable creatures, the first true human beings. Thus it was that the dawn mammals, springing from the North American lemur type, gave origin to the mid-mammals, and these mid-mammals in turn produced the superior primates, who became the immediate ancestors of the primitive human race. The primates' tribes were the last vital link in the evolution of man, but in less than 5,000 years, not a single individual of these extraordinary tribes was left. 5. The first human beings. From the year A.D. 1934 back to the birth of the first 2 human beings is just 993,419 years. These 2 remarkable creatures were true human beings. They possessed perfect human thumbs, as had many of their ancestors, while they had just as perfect feet as the present-day human races. They were walkers and runners, not climbers. The grasping function of the big toe was absent, completely absent. When danger drove them to the treetops, they climbed just like the humans of today would. They would climb up the trunk of a tree like a bear, and not as would a chimpanzee or a gorilla, swinging up by the branches. These first human beings, and their descendants, reached full maturity at 12 years of age, and possessed a potential lifespan of about 75 years. Many new emotions early appeared in these human twins. They experienced admiration for both objects and other beings and exhibited considerable vanity. But the most remarkable advance in emotional development was the sudden appearance of a new group of really human feelings, the worshipful group, embracing awe, reverence, humility, and even a primitive form of gratitude. Fear, joined with ignorance of natural phenomena, is about to give birth to primitive religion. Not only were such human feelings manifested in these primitive humans, but many more highly evolved sentiments were also present in rudimentary form. They were mildly cognizant of pity, shame, and reproach, and were acutely conscious of love, hate, and revenge, being also susceptible to marked feelings of jealousy. These first two humans, the twins, were a great trial to their primates' parents. They were so curious and adventurous that they nearly lost their lives on numerous occasions before they were 8 years old. As it was, they were rather well scarred up by the time they were 12. Very early they learned to engage in verbal communication. By the age of 10, they had worked out an improved sign and word language of almost 100 ideas and had greatly improved and expanded the crude communicative technique of their ancestors. But try as hard as they might, they were able to teach only a few of their new signs and symbols to their parents. When about 9 years of age, they journeyed off down the river one bright day and held a momentous conference. Every celestial intelligence stationed on Urantia, including myself, was present as an observer of the transactions of this noontide tryst. On this eventful day, they arrived at an understanding to live with and for each other, and this was the first of a series of such agreements which finally culminated in the decision to flee from their inferior animal associates and to journey northward, little knowing that they were thus to found the human race. While we were all greatly concerned with what these two little savages were planning, we were powerless to control the working of their minds. We did not, could not, arbitrarily influence their decisions. But within the permissible limits of planetary function, we, the life carriers, together with our associates, all conspired to lead the human twins northward and far from their hairy and partially tree-dwelling people. And so, by reason of their own intelligent choice, the twins did migrate, and because of our supervision, they migrated northward to a secluded region where they escaped the possibility of biologic degradation through admixture with their inferior relatives of the primates' tribes. Shortly before their departure from the home forest, they lost their mother in a gibbon raid. While she did not possess their intelligence, she did have a worthy mammalian affection of a high order for her offspring, and she fearlessly gave her life in the attempt to save the wonderful pair. Nor was her sacrifice in vain, for she held off the enemy until the father arrived with reinforcements and put the invaders to rout. Soon after this young couple forsook their associates to found the human race, their primate's father became disconsolate. He was heartbroken. He refused to eat, even when food was brought to him by his other children. His brilliant offspring having been lost, life did not seem worth living among his ordinary fellows. So he wandered off into the forest, was set upon by hostile gibbons, and beaten to death. 6. Evolution of the human mind. We, the life carriers on Urantia, had passed through the long vigil of watchful waiting since the day we first planted the life plasm in the planetary waters, and naturally the appearance of the first really intelligent and volitional beings brought to us great joy and supreme satisfaction. We had been watching the twins develop mentally through our observation of the functioning of the 7 adjutant mind spirits assigned to Urantia at the time of our arrival on the planet. Throughout the long evolutionary development of planetary life, these tireless mind ministers had ever registered their increasing ability to contact with the successively expanding brain capacities of the progressively superior animal creatures. At first, only the spirit of intuition could function in the instinctive and reflex behavior of the primordial animal life. With the differentiation of higher types, the spirit of understanding was able to endow such creatures with the gift of spontaneous association of ideas. Later on, we observed the spirit of courage in operation. Evolving animals really developed a crude form of protective self-consciousness. Subsequent to the appearance of the mammalian groups, we beheld the spirit of knowledge manifesting itself in increased measure. And the evolution of the higher mammals brought the function of the spirit of counsel, with the resulting growth of the herd instinct and the beginnings of primitive social development. Increasingly, on down through the dawn mammals, the mid-mammals, and the primates, we had observed the augmented service of the first 5 adjutants, but never had the remaining 2, the highest mind ministers, been able to function in the Urantia type of evolutionary mind. Imagine our joy one day. The twins were about 10 years old, when the spirit of worship made its first contact with the mind of the female twin, and shortly thereafter with the male. We knew that something closely akin to human mind was approaching culmination. And when, about a year later, they finally resolved, as a result of meditative thought and purposeful decision, to flee from home and journey north, then did the spirit of wisdom begin to function on Urantia, and in these 2 now recognized human minds. There was an immediate and new order of mobilization of the 7 adjutant mind spirits. We were alive with expectation. We realized that the long-waited-for hour was approaching. We knew we were upon the threshold of the realization of our protracted effort to evolve will creatures on Urantia. 7. Recognition as an inhabited world. We did not have to wait long. At noon, the day after the runaway of the twins, there occurred the initial test flash of the universe circuit signals at the planetary reception focus of Urantia. We were, of course, all astir with the realization that a great event was impending. But since this world was a life experiment station, we had not the slightest idea of just how we would be apprised of the recognition of intelligent life on the planet. But we were not long in suspense. On the 3rd day after the elopement of the twins, and before the life carrier corps departed, there arrived the Nebadon Archangel of Initial Planetary Circuit Establishment. It was an eventful day on Urantia when our small group gathered about the planetary pole of space communication and received the first message from Salvington over the newly established mind circuit of the planet. And this first message, dictated by the chief of the Archangel Corps, said, "To the life carriers on Urantia, greetings. We transmit assurance of great pleasure on Salvington, Edentia, and Jerusalem, in honor of the registration on the headquarters of Nebadon of the signal of the existence on Urantia of mind of will dignity. The purposeful decision of the twins to flee northward and segregate their offspring from their inferior ancestors has been noted. This is the first decision of mind, the human type of mind, on Urantia, and automatically establishes the circuit of communication over which this initial message of acknowledgement is transmitting. Next, over this new circuit, came the greetings of the Most Highs of Edentia, containing instructions for the resident life carriers, forbidding us to interfere with the pattern of life we had established. We were directed not to intervene in the affairs of human progress. It should not be inferred that life carriers ever arbitrarily and mechanically interfere with the natural outworking of the planetary evolutionary plans, for we do not. But up to this time, we had been permitted to manipulate the environment and shield the life plasm in a special manner, and it was this extraordinary, but wholly natural, supervision that was to be discontinued. And no sooner had the Most Highs left off speaking than the beautiful message of Lucifer, then sovereign of the Satania system, began to planetize. Now the life carriers heard the welcome words of their own chief and received his permission to return to Jerusalem. This message from Lucifer contained the official acceptance of the life carriers' work on Urantia and absolved us from all future criticism of any of our efforts to improve the life patterns of Nebadon as established in the Satania system. These messages from Salvington, Urantia, and Jerusalem formally marked the termination of the life carriers' age-long supervision of the planet. For ages we had been on duty, assisted only by the 7 adjutant mind spirits and the master physical controllers. And now, will, the power of choosing to worship and to ascend, having appeared in the evolutionary creatures of the planet, we realized that our work was finished, and our group prepared to depart. Urantia being a life modification world, permission was granted to leave behind 2 senior life carriers with 12 assistants, and I was chosen as one of this group and have ever since been on Urantia. It is just 993,408 years ago, from the year A.D. 1934, that Urantia was formally recognized as a planet of human habitation in the universe of Nebadon. Biologic evolution had once again achieved the human levels of will dignity. Man had arrived on planet 606 of Satania.
Sponsored by a life carrier of Nebadon, resident on Urantia.
Paper 63. The First Human Family. Urantia was registered as an inhabited world when the first 2 human beings, the twins, were 11 years old, and before they had become the parents of the firstborn of the 2nd generation of actual human beings. And the archangel message from Salvington, on this occasion of formal planetary recognition, closed with these words: Man-mind has appeared on 606 of Satania, and these parents of the new race shall be called Andan and Fanta. And all archangels pray that these creatures may speedily be endowed with the personal indwelling of the gift of the Spirit of the Universal Father. Andan is the Nebadon name which signifies the first father-like creature to exhibit human perfection hunger. Fanta signifies the first son-like creature to exhibit human perfection hunger. Andan and Fanta never knew these names until they were bestowed upon them at the time of fusion with their thought adjusters. Throughout their mortal sojourn on Urantia, they called each other Santa Ann and Santa N. Santa Ann meaning loved by mother, Santa N signifying loved by father. They gave themselves these names, and the meanings are significant of their mutual regard and affection. 1. Andan and Fanta. In many respects, Andan and Fanta were the most remarkable pair of human beings that have ever lived on the face of the earth. This wonderful pair, the actual parents of all mankind, were in every way superior to many of their immediate descendants, and they were radically different from all of their ancestors, both immediate and remote. The parents of this first human couple were apparently little different from the average of their tribe, though they were among its more intelligent members, that group which first learned to throw stones and to use clubs in fighting. They also made use of sharp spicules of stone, flint, and bone. While still living with his parents, Andan had fastened a sharp piece of flint on the end of a club, using animal tendons for this purpose, and on no less than a dozen occasions He made good use of such a weapon in saving both his own life and that of his equally adventurous and inquisitive sister, who unfailingly accompanied him on all of his tours of exploration. The decision of Andan and Fanta to flee from the primates' tribes implies a quality of mind far above the baser intelligence which characterized so many of their later descendants who stooped to mate with their retarded cousins of the simian tribes. But their vague feeling of being something more than mere animals was due to the possession of personality and was augmented by the indwelling presence of the thought adjusters. 2. The Flight of the Twins. After Andan and Fanta had decided to flee northward, they succumbed to their fears for a time, especially the fear of displeasing their father and immediate family. They envisaged being set upon by hostile relatives and thus recognized the possibility of meeting death at the hands of their already jealous tribesmen. As youngsters, the twins had spent most of their time in each other's company, and for this reason had never been overly popular with their animal cousins of the primates tribe. Nor had they improved their standing in the tribe by building a separate and very superior tree home. And it was in this new home among the treetops, one night after they had been awakened by a violent storm, and as they held each other in fearful and fond embrace, that they finally and fully made up their minds to flee from the tribal habitat and the home treetops. They had already prepared a crude treetop retreat some half-day's journey to the north. This was their secret and safe hiding place for the first day away from the home forests. Notwithstanding that the twins shared the primates' deathly fear of being on the ground at night-time, they sallied forth shortly before nightfall on their northern trek. While it required unusual courage for them to undertake this night journey, even with a full moon, they correctly concluded that they were less likely to be missed and pursued by their tribesmen and relatives, and they safely made their previously prepared rendezvous shortly after midnight. On their northward journey, they discovered an exposed flint deposit, and finding many stones suitably shaped for various uses, gathered up a supply for the future. In attempting to chip these flints so that they would be better adapted for certain purposes, Andan discovered their sparking quality and conceived the idea of building fire. But the notion did not take firm hold of him at the time, as the climate was still salubrious and there was little need of fire. But the autumn sun was getting lower in the sky, and as they journeyed northward, the nights grew cooler and cooler. Already they had been forced to make use of animal skins for warmth. Before they had been away from home one moon, Andan signified to his mate that he thought he could make fire with the flint. They tried for 2 months to utilize the flint spark for kindling a fire, but only met with failure. Each day this couple would strike the flints and endeavor to ignite the wood. Finally, one evening, about the time of the setting of the sun, the secret of the technique was unraveled when it occurred to Fanta to climb a nearby tree to secure an abandoned bird's nest. The nest was dry and highly inflammable, and consequently flared right up into a full blaze the moment the spark fell upon it. They were so surprised and startled at their success that they almost lost the fire, but they saved it by the addition of suitable fuel, and then began the first search for firewood by the parents of all mankind. This was one of the most joyous moments in their short but eventful lives. All night long they sat up watching their fire burn, vaguely realizing that they had made a discovery which would make it possible for them to defy climate and thus forever to be independent of their animal relatives of the southern lands. After 3 days' rest and enjoyment of the fire, they journeyed on. The primates' ancestors of Andan had often replenished fire which had been kindled by lightning, but never before had the creatures of earth possessed a method of starting fire at will. But it was a long time before the twins learned that dry moss and other materials would kindle fire just as well as birds' nests. 3. Andon's family. It was almost 2 years from the night of the twins' departure from home before their first child was born. They named him Santad, and Santad was the first creature to be born on Urantia who was wrapped in protective coverings at the time of birth. The human race had begun, and with this new evolution there appeared the instinct properly to care for the increasingly enfeebled infants, which would characterize the progressive development of mind of the intellectual order as contrasted with the more purely animal type. Andon and Fanta had 19 children in all, and they lived to enjoy the association of almost 100 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. The family was domiciled in 4 adjoining rock shelters, or semi-caves, 3 of which were interconnected by hallways which had been excavated in the soft limestone with flint tools devised by Andon's children. These early Andonites evinced a very marked clannish spirit. They hunted in groups and never strayed very far from the home site. They seemed to realize that they were an isolated and unique group of living beings and should therefore avoid becoming separated. This feeling of intimate kinship was undoubtedly due to the enhanced mind ministry of the adjutant spirits. Andon and Fanta labored incessantly for the nurture and uplift of the clan. They lived to the age of 42, when both were killed at the time of an earthquake by the falling of an overhanging rock. 5 of their children and 11 grandchildren perished with them, and almost a score of their descendants suffered serious injuries. Upon the death of his parents, Santad, despite a seriously injured foot, immediately assumed the leadership of the clan and was ably assisted by his wife, his eldest sister. Their first task was to roll up stones to effectively entomb their dead parents, brothers, sisters, and children. Undue significance should not attach to this act of burial. Their ideas of survival after death were very vague and indefinite, being largely derived from their fantastic and variegated dream life. This family of Andon and Fanta held together until the 20th generation, when combined food competition and social friction brought about the beginning of dispersion. 4. The Andonic clans. Primitive man, the Andonites, had black eyes and a swarthy complexion, something of a cross between yellow and red. Melanin is a coloring substance which is found in the skins of all human beings. It is the original Andonic skin pigment. In general appearance and skin color, these early Andonites more nearly resembled the present-day Eskimo than any other type of living human beings. They were the first creatures to use the skins of animals as a protection against cold. They had little more hair on their bodies than present-day humans. The tribal life of the animal ancestors of these early men had foreshadowed the beginnings of numerous social conventions, and with the expanding emotions and augmented brain powers of these beings, there was an immediate development in social organization and a new division of clan labor. They were exceedingly imitative, but the play instinct was only slightly developed, and the sense of humor was almost entirely absent. Primitive man smiled occasionally, but he never indulged in hearty laughter. Humor was the legacy of the later Adamic race. These early human beings were not so sensitive to pain, nor so reactive to unpleasant situations as were many of the later evolving mortals. Childbirth was not a painful or distressing ordeal to Fanta and her immediate progeny. They were a wonderful tribe. The males would fight heroically for the safety of their mates and their offspring. The females were affectionately devoted to their children. But their patriotism was wholly limited to the immediate clan. They were very loyal to their families. They would die without question in defense of their children, but they were not able to grasp the idea of trying to make the world a better place for their grandchildren. Altruism was as yet unborn in the human heart, notwithstanding that all of the emotions essential to the birth of religion were already present in these Urantia aborigines. These early men possessed a touching affection for their comrades and certainly had a real, although crude, idea of friendship. It was a common sight in later times, during their constantly recurring battles with the inferior tribes, to see one of these primitive men valiantly fighting with one hand while he struggled on, trying to protect and save an injured fellow warrior. Many of the most noble and highly human traits of subsequent evolutionary development were touchingly foreshadowed in these primitive peoples. The original Andonic clan maintained an unbroken line of leadership until the 27th generation, when, no male offspring appearing among Sontad's direct descendants, two rival would-be rulers of the clan fell to fighting for supremacy. Before the extensive dispersion of the Andonic clans, a well-developed language had evolved from their early efforts to intercommunicate. This language continued to grow, and almost daily additions were made to it because of the new inventions and adaptations to environment which were developed by these active, restless, and curious people. And this language became the word of Urantia, the tongue of the early human family, until the later appearance of the colored races. As time passed, the Andonic clans grew in number, and the contact of the expanding families developed friction and misunderstandings. Only two things came to occupy the minds of these peoples: hunting to obtain food and fighting to avenge themselves against some real or supposed injustice or insult at the hands of the neighboring tribes. Family feuds increased, tribal wars broke out, and serious losses were sustained among the very best elements of the more able and advanced groups. Some of these losses were irreparable. Some of the most valuable strains of ability and intelligence were forever lost to the world. This early race and its primitive civilization were threatened with extinction by this incessant warfare of the clans. It is impossible to induce such primitive beings long to live together in peace. Man is the descendant of fighting animals, and when closely associated, uncultured people irritate and offend each other. The life carriers know this tendency among evolutionary creatures, and accordingly make provision for the eventual separation of developing human beings into at least 3, and more often 6, distinct and separate races. 5. Dispersion of the Andonites. The early Andon races did not penetrate very far into Asia, and they did not at first enter Africa. The geography of those times pointed them north, and farther north these people journeyed until they were hindered by the slowly advancing ice of the third glacier. Before this extensive ice sheet reached France and the British Isles, the descendants of Andon and Fanta had pushed on westward over Europe and had established more than 1,000 separate settlements along the great rivers leading to the then warm waters of the North Sea. These Andonic tribes were the early river dwellers of France. They lived along the river Somme for tens of thousands of years. The Somme is the one river unchanged by the glaciers, running down to the sea in those days much as it does today. And that explains why so much evidence of the Andonic descendants is found along the course of this river valley. These aborigines of Urantia were not tree dwellers, though in emergencies they still betook themselves to the treetops. They regularly dwelt under the shelter of overhanging cliffs, along the rivers and in hillside grottos, which afforded a good view of the approaches and sheltered them from the elements. They could thus enjoy the comfort of their fires without being too much inconvenienced by the smoke. They were not really cave dwellers either, though in subsequent times the later ice sheets came farther south and drove their descendants to the caves. They preferred to camp near the edge of a forest and beside a stream. They very early became remarkably clever in disguising their partially sheltered abodes and showed great skill in constructing stone sleeping chambers, dome-shaped stone huts, into which they crawled at night. The entrance to such a hut was closed by rolling a stone in front of it, a large stone which had been placed inside for this purpose before the roof stones were finally put in place. The Andanites were fearless and successful hunters, and with the exception of wild berries and certain fruits of the trees, lived exclusively on flesh. As Andan had invented the stone axe, so his descendants early discovered and made effective use of the throwing stick and the harpoon. At last, a tool-creating mind was functioning in conjunction with an implement-using hand, and these early humans became highly skillful in the fashioning of flint tools. They traveled far and wide in search of flint, much as present-day humans journey to the ends of the earth in quest of gold, platinum, and diamonds. And in many other ways, these Andan tribes manifested a degree of intelligence which their retrogressing descendants did not attain in 500,000 years, though they did again and again rediscover various methods of kindling fire. 6. Anagar, the first truth teacher. As the Andonic dispersion extended, the cultural and spiritual status of the clans retrogressed for nearly 10,000 years until the days of Anagar, who assumed the leadership of these tribes, brought peace among them, and for the first time led all of them in the worship of the breath-giver to men and animals. Andan's philosophy had been most confused. He had barely escaped becoming a fire worshipper because of the great comfort derived from his accidental discovery of fire. Reason, however, directed him from his own discovery to the sun as a superior and more awe-inspiring source of heat and light, but it was too remote, and so he failed to become a sun worshipper. The Andanites early developed a fear of the elements, thunder, lightning, rain, snow, hail, and ice. But hunger was the constantly recurring urge of these early days, and since they largely subsisted on animals, they eventually evolved a form of animal worship. To Andan, the larger food animals were symbols of creative might and sustaining power. From time to time, it became the custom to designate various of these larger animals as objects of worship. During the vogue of a particular animal, crude outlines of it would be drawn on the walls of the caves, and later on, as continued progress was made in the arts, such an animal god was engraved on various ornaments. Very early, the Andonic peoples formed the habit of refraining from eating the flesh of the animal of tribal veneration. Presently, in order more suitably to impress the minds of their youths, they evolved a ceremony of reverence which was carried out about the body of one of these venerated animals, and still later on, this primitive performance developed into the more elaborate sacrificial ceremonies of their descendants. And this is the origin of sacrifices as a part of worship. This idea was elaborated by Moses in the Hebrew ritual and was preserved in principle by the Apostle Paul as the doctrine of atonement for sin by the shedding of blood. That food was the all-important thing in the lives of these primitive human beings is shown by the prayer taught these simple folks by Anagar, their great teacher. And this prayer was, "O breath of life, give us this day our daily food. Deliver us from the curse of the ice. Save us from our forest enemies, and with mercy receive us into the great beyond." Anagar maintained headquarters on the northern shores of the ancient Mediterranean in the region of the present Caspian Sea at a settlement called Oban, the tarrying place on the westward turning of the travel trail leading up northward from the Mesopotamian Southland. From Oban, he sent out teachers to the remote settlements to spread his new doctrines of one deity and his concept of the hereafter, which he called the Great Beyond. These emissaries of Anagar were the world's first missionaries. They were also the first human beings to cook meat, the first regularly to use fire in the preparation of food. They cooked flesh on the ends of sticks and also on hot stones. Later on they roasted large pieces in the fire, but their descendants almost entirely reverted to the use of raw flesh. Anagar was born 983,323 years ago from A.D. 1934, and he lived to be 69 years of age. The record of the achievements of this mastermind and spiritual leader of the pre-planetary prince days is a thrilling recital of the organization of these primitive peoples into a real society. He instituted an efficient tribal government, the like of which was not attained by succeeding generations in many millenniums. Never again, until the arrival of the planetary prince, was there such a high spiritual civilization on Earth. These simple people had a real though primitive religion, but it was subsequently lost to their deteriorating descendants. Although both Andan and Fanta had received thought adjusters, as had many of their descendants, it was not until the days of Anagar that the adjusters and guardian seraphim came in great numbers to Urantia. This was, indeed, the golden age of primitive man. 7. The survival of Andan and Fanta. Andan and Fanta, the splendid founders of the human race, received recognition at the time of the adjudication of Urantia upon the arrival of the planetary prince, and in due time they emerged from the regime of the Mansion worlds with citizenship status on Jerusalem. Although they have never been permitted to return to Urantia, they are cognizant of the history of the race they founded. They grieved over the Caligastia betrayal, sorrowed because of the Adamic failure, but rejoiced exceedingly when announcement was received that Michael had selected their world as the theater for his final bestowal. On Jerusalem, both Andan and Fanta were fused with their thought adjusters, as also were several of their children, including Santad, but the majority of even their immediate descendants only achieved spirit fusion. Andan and Fanta, shortly after their arrival on Jerusalem, received permission from the system sovereign to return to the first Mansion world to serve with the Morantia personalities who welcome the pilgrims of time from Urantia to the heavenly spheres, and they have been assigned indefinitely to this service. They sought to send greetings to Urantia in connection with these revelations, but this request was wisely denied them. And this is the recital of the most heroic and fascinating chapter in all the history of Urantia, the story of the evolution, life struggles, death, and eternal survival of the unique parents of all mankind.
Presented by a life carrier resident on Urantia.
Paper 64. The Evolutionary Races of Color. This is the story of the evolutionary races of Urantia from the days of Andan and Fanta, almost 1 million years ago, down through the times of the planetary prince to the end of the Ice Age. The human race is almost 1 million years old, and the first half of its story roughly corresponds to the pre-planetary prince days of Urantia. The latter half of the history of mankind begins at the time of the arrival of the planetary prince and the appearance of the 6 colored races and roughly corresponds to the period commonly regarded as the Old Stone Age. 1. The Andonic Aborigines. Primitive man made his evolutionary appearance on Earth a little less than 1 million years ago, and he had a vigorous experience. He instinctively sought to escape the danger of mingling with the inferior simian tribes. but he could not migrate eastward because of the arid Tibetan land elevations, 30,000 feet above sea level. Neither could he go south nor west because of the expanded Mediterranean Sea, which then extended eastward to the Indian Ocean. And as he went north, he encountered the advancing ice. But even when further migration was blocked by the ice, and though the dispersing tribes became increasingly hostile, the more intelligent groups never entertained the idea of going southward to live among their hairy, tree-dwelling cousins of inferior intellect. Many of man's earliest religious emotions grew out of his feeling of helplessness in the shut-in environment of this geographic situation, mountains to the right, water to the left, and ice in front. But these progressive Andonites would not turn back to their inferior tree-dwelling relatives in the south. These Andonites avoided the forests in contrast with the habits of their non-human relatives. In the forests, man has always deteriorated. Human evolution has made progress only in the open and in the higher latitudes. The cold and hunger of the open lands stimulate action, invention, and resourcefulness. While these Andonic tribes were developing, the pioneers of the present human race, amidst the hardships and privations of these rugged northern climes, their backward cousins were luxuriating in the southern tropical forests of the land of their early common origin. These events occurred during the times of the third glacier, the first according to the reckoning of geologists. The first two glaciers were not extensive in northern Europe. During most of the Ice Age, England was connected by land with France, while later on Africa was joined to Europe by the Sicilian land bridge. At the time of the Andonic migrations, there was a continuous land path from England in the west on through Europe and Asia to Java in the east. But Australia was again isolated, which further accentuated the development of its own peculiar fauna. 950,000 years ago, the descendants of Andon and Fonta had migrated far to the east and to the west. To the west, they passed over Europe to France and England. In later times, they penetrated eastward as far as Java, where their bones were so recently found, the so-called Java man, and then journeyed on to Tasmania. The groups going west became less contaminated with the backward stocks of mutual ancestral origin than those going east, who mingled so freely with their retarded animal cousins. These unprogressive individuals drifted southward and presently mated with the inferior tribes. Later on, increasing numbers of their mongrel descendants returned to the north to mate with the rapidly expanding Andonic peoples, and such unfortunate unions unfailingly deteriorated the superior stock. Fewer and fewer of the primitive settlements maintained the worship of the breath-giver. This early dawn civilization was threatened with extinction. And thus it has ever been on Urantia. Civilizations of great promise have successively deteriorated and have finally been extinguished by the folly of allowing the superior freely to procreate with the inferior. 2. The Foxhall peoples. 900,000 years ago, the arts of Andon and Fonta and the culture of Anagar were vanishing from the face of the earth. Culture, religion, and even flint-working were at their lowest ebb. These were the times when large numbers of inferior mongrel groups were arriving in England from southern France. These tribes were so largely mixed with the forest ape-like creatures that they were scarcely human. They had no religion but were crude flint-workers and possessed sufficient intelligence to kindle fire. They were followed in Europe by a somewhat superior and prolific people, whose descendants soon spread over the entire continent from the ice in the north to the Alps and Mediterranean in the south. These tribes are the so-called Heidelberg race. During this long period of cultural decadence, the Foxhall peoples of England and the Badanan tribes northwest of India continued to hold on to some of the traditions of Andon and certain remnants of the culture of Anagar. The Foxhall peoples were farthest west and succeeded in retaining much of the Andonic culture. They also preserved their knowledge of flintworking, which they transmitted to their descendants, the ancient ancestors of the Eskimos. Though the remains of the Foxhall peoples were the last to be discovered in England, these Andonites were really the first human beings to live in those regions. At that time, the land bridge still connected France with England, and since most of the early settlements of the Andon descendants were located along the rivers and seashores of that early day, they are now under the waters of the English Channel and the North Sea, but some 3 or 4 are still above water on the English coast. Many of the more intelligent and spiritual of the Foxhall peoples maintained their racial superiority and perpetuated their primitive religious customs, and these people, as they were later admixed with subsequent stocks, journeyed on west from England after a later ice visitation and have survived as the present-day Eskimos. 3. The Badonan tribes. Besides the Foxhall peoples in the west, another struggling center of culture persisted in the east. This group was located in the foothills of the northwestern Indian highlands among the tribes of Badonan, a great-great-grandson of Andon. These people were the only descendants of Andon who never practiced human sacrifice. These highland Badonites occupied an extensive plateau surrounded by forests, traversed by streams, and abounding in game. Like some of their cousins in Tibet, they lived in crude stone huts, hillside grottos, and semi-underground passages. While the tribes of the north grew more and more to fear the ice, those living near the homeland of their origin became exceedingly fearful of the water. They observed the Mesopotamian peninsula gradually sinking into the ocean, and though it emerged several times, the traditions of these primitive races grew up around the dangers of the sea and the fear of periodic engulfment. And this fear, together with their experience with river floods, explains why they sought out the highlands as a safe place in which to live. To the east of the Badonan peoples, in the Siwalik Hills of northern India, may be found fossils that approach nearer to transition types between man and the various pre-human groups than any others on Earth. 850,000 years ago, the superior Badonan tribes began a warfare of extermination directed against their inferior and animalistic neighbors. In less than 1,000 years, most of the borderland animal groups of these regions had been either destroyed or driven back to the southern forests. This campaign for the extermination of inferiors brought about a slight improvement in the hill tribes of that age, and the mixed descendants of this improved Badonite stock appeared on the stage of action as an apparently new people, the Neanderthal race. 4. The Neanderthal races. The Neanderthalers were excellent fighters, and they traveled extensively. They gradually spread from the highland centers in northwest India to France on the west, China on the east, and even down into northern Africa. They dominated the world for almost 500,000 years until the times of the migration of the evolutionary races of color. 800,000 years ago, game was abundant. Many species of deer, as well as elephants and hippopotamuses, roamed over Europe. Cattle were plentiful. Horses and wolves were everywhere. The Neanderthalers were great hunters, and the tribes in France were the first to adopt the practice of giving the most successful hunters the choice of women for wives. The reindeer was highly useful to these Neanderthal peoples, serving as food, clothing, and for tools, since they made various uses of the horns and bones. They had little culture, but they greatly improved the work in flint until it almost reached the levels of the days of Andon. Large flints attached to wooden handles came back into use and served as axes and picks. 750,000 years ago, the fourth ice sheet was well on its way south. With their improved implements, the Neanderthalers made holes in the ice, covering the northern rivers, and thus were able to spear the fish which came up to these vents. Ever these tribes retreated before the advancing ice, which at this time made its most extensive invasion of Europe. In these times, the Siberian glacier was making its southernmost march, compelling early man to move southward, back toward the lands of his origin. But the human species had so differentiated that the danger of further mingling with its non-progressive simian relatives was greatly lessened. 700,000 years ago, the fourth glacier, the greatest of all in Europe, was in recession. Men and animals were returning north. The climate was cool and moist, and primitive man again thrived in Europe and Western Asia. Gradually, the forests spread north over land which had been so recently covered by the glacier. Mammalian life had been little changed by the great glacier. These animals persisted in that narrow belt of land lying between the ice and the Alps, and, upon the retreat of the glacier, again rapidly spread out over all Europe. There arrived from Africa, over the Sicilian land bridge, straight-tusked elephants, broad-nosed rhinoceroses, hyenas, and African lions, and these new animals virtually exterminated the saber-toothed tigers and the hippopotamuses. 650,000 years ago witnessed the continuation of the mild climate. By the middle of the interglacial period, it had become so warm that the Alps were almost denuded of ice and snow. 600,000 years ago, the ice had reached its then northernmost point of retreat, and after a pause of a few thousand years, started south again on its fifth excursion. But there was little modification of climate for 50,000 years. Man and the animals of Europe were little changed. The slight aridity of the former period lessened, and the alpine glaciers descended far down the river valleys. 550,000 years ago, the advancing glacier again pushed man and the animals south. But this time, man had plenty of room in the wide belt of land stretching northeast into Asia and lying between the ice sheet and the then greatly expanded Black Sea extension of the Mediterranean. These times of the fourth and fifth glaciers witnessed the further spread of the crude culture of the Neanderthal races. But there was so little progress that it truly appeared as though the attempt to produce a new and modified type of intelligent life on Urantia was about to fail. For almost 250,000 years, these primitive peoples drifted on, hunting and fighting, by spells improving in certain directions, but on the whole, steadily retrogressing as compared with their superior Andonic ancestors. During these spiritually dark ages, the culture of superstitious mankind reached its lowest levels. The Neanderthalers really had no religion beyond a shameful superstition. They were deathly afraid of clouds, more especially of mists and fogs. A primitive religion of the fear of natural forces gradually developed, while animal worship declined as improvement in tools, with abundance of game, enabled these people to live with lessened anxiety about food. The sex rewards of the chase tended greatly to improve hunting skill. This new religion of fear led to attempts to placate the invisible forces behind these natural elements and culminated, later on, in the sacrificing of humans to appease these invisible and unknown physical forces. And this terrible practice of human sacrifice has been perpetuated by the more backward peoples of Urantia right on down to the 20th century. These early Neanderthalers could hardly be called sun worshippers. They rather lived in fear of the dark. They had a mortal dread of nightfall. As long as the moon shone a little, they managed to get along, but in the dark of the moon they grew panicky and began the sacrifice of their best specimens of manhood and womanhood in an effort to induce the moon again to shine. The sun, they early learned, would regularly return, But the moon, they conjectured, only returned because they sacrificed their fellow tribesmen. As the race advanced, the object and purpose of sacrifice progressively changed, but the offering of human sacrifice as a part of religious ceremonial long persisted. 5. Origin of the colored races. 500,000 years ago, the Badonan tribes of the northwestern highlands of India became involved in another great racial struggle. For more than 100 years, this relentless warfare raged. And when the long fight was finished, only about 100 families were left. But these survivors were the most intelligent and desirable of all the then living descendants of Andan and Fanta. And now, among these highland Badanites, there was a new and strange occurrence. A man and woman living in the northeastern part of the then inhabited highland region began suddenly to produce a family of unusually intelligent children. This was the Sangik family, the ancestors of all of the 6 colored races of Urantia. These Sangik children, 19 in number, were not only intelligent above their fellows, but their skins manifested a unique tendency to turn various colors upon exposure to sunlight. Among these 19 children were 5 red, 2 orange, 4 yellow, 2 green, 4 blue, and 2 indigo. These colors became more pronounced as the children grew older, and when these youths later mated with their fellow tribesmen, all of their offspring tended toward the skin color of the Sangik parent. And now I interrupt the chronological narrative, after calling attention to the arrival of the planetary prince at about this time, while we separately consider the 6 Sangik races of Urantia. 6. The 6 Sangik races of Urantia. On an average evolutionary planet, the 6 evolutionary races of color appear one by one. The red man is the first to evolve, and for ages he roams the world before the succeeding colored races make their appearance. The simultaneous emergence of all 6 races on Urantia, and in one family, was most unusual. The appearance of the earlier Andanites on Urantia was also something new in Satania. On no other world in the local system has such a race of will creatures evolved in advance of the evolutionary races of color. 1. The Red Man. These peoples were remarkable specimens of the human race, in many ways superior to Andan and Fanta. They were a most intelligent group, and were the first of the Sangik children to develop a tribal civilization and government. They were always monogamous. Even their mixed descendants seldom practiced plural mating. In later times, they had serious and prolonged trouble with their yellow brethren in Asia. They were aided by their early invention of the bow and arrow, but they had unfortunately inherited much of the tendency of their ancestors to fight among themselves, and this so weakened them that the yellow tribes were able to drive them off the Asiatic continent. About 85,000 years ago, the comparatively pure remnants of the red race went en masse across to North America, and shortly thereafter the Bering Land Isthmus sank, thus isolating them. No red man ever returned to Asia, but throughout Siberia, China, Central Asia, India, and Europe they left behind much of their stock blended with the other colored races. When the red man crossed over into America, he brought along much of the teachings and traditions of his early origin. His immediate ancestors had been in touch with the later activities of the world headquarters of the planetary prince. But in a short time after reaching the Americas, the red men began to lose sight of these teachings, and there occurred a great decline in intellectual and spiritual culture. Very soon these people again fell to fighting so fiercely among themselves that it appeared that these tribal wars would result in the speedy extinction of this remnant of the comparatively pure red race. Because of this great retrogression, the red men seemed doomed when, about 65,000 years ago, Anamannalantan appeared as their leader and spiritual deliverer. He brought temporary peace among the American red men and revived their worship of the Great Spirit. Anamannalantan lived to be 96 years of age and maintained his headquarters among the great redwood trees of California. Many of his later descendants have come down to modern times among the Blackfoot Indians. As time passed, the teachings of Anamannalantan became hazy traditions. Internecine wars were resumed, and never after the days of this great teacher did another leader succeed in bringing universal peace among them. Increasingly, the more intelligent strains perished in these tribal struggles. Otherwise, a great civilization would have been built upon the North American continent by these able and intelligent red men. After crossing over to America from China, the northern red man never again came in contact with other world influences, except the Eskimo, until he was later discovered by the white man. It was most unfortunate that the red man almost completely missed his opportunity of being upstepped by the admixture of the later Adamic stock. As it was, the red man could not rule the white man, and he would not willingly serve him. In such a circumstance, if the two races do not blend, one or the other is doomed. 2. The Orange Man. The outstanding characteristic of this race was their peculiar urge to build anything and everything, even to the piling up of vast mounds of stone just to see which tribe could build the largest mound. Though they were not a progressive people, they profited much from the schools of the prince and sent delegates there for instruction. The Orange race was the first to follow the coastline southward toward Africa as the Mediterranean Sea withdrew to the west. But they never secured a favorable footing in Africa and were wiped out of existence by the later arriving Green race. Before the end came, this people lost much cultural and spiritual ground. But there was a great revival of higher living as a result of the wise leadership of Porshunta, the mastermind of this unfortunate race, who ministered to them when their headquarters was at Armageddon some 300,000 years ago. The last great struggle between the Orange and the Green men occurred in the region of the Lower Nile Valley in Egypt. This long, drawn-out battle was waged for almost 100 years, and at its close very few of the Orange race were left alive. The shattered remnants of these people were absorbed by the Green and by the later arriving Indigo men. But as a race, the Orange man ceased to exist about 100,000 years ago. 3. The Yellow Man. The primitive yellow tribes were the first to abandon the chase, establish settled communities, and develop a home life based on agriculture. Intellectually, they were somewhat inferior to the red man, but socially and collectively they proved themselves superior to all of the Sangic peoples in the matter of fostering racial civilization. Because they developed a fraternal spirit, the various tribes learning to live together in relative peace, they were able to drive the red race before them as they gradually expanded into Asia. They traveled far from the influences of the spiritual headquarters of the world and drifted into great darkness, following the Caligastia apostasy. But there occurred one brilliant age among this people when Singlangton, about 100,000 years ago, assumed the leadership of these tribes and proclaimed the worship of the one truth. The survival of comparatively large numbers of the yellow race is due to their intertribal peacefulness. From the days of Singlangton to the times of modern China, the yellow race has been numbered among the more peaceful of the nations of Urantia. This race received a small but potent legacy of the later imported Adamic stock. 4. The Green Man. The green race was one of the less able groups of primitive men, and they were greatly weakened by extensive migrations in different directions. Before their dispersion, these tribes experienced a great revival of culture under the leadership of Fantad, some 350,000 years ago. The green race split into three major divisions. The northern tribes were subdued, enslaved, and absorbed by the yellow and blue races. The eastern group were amalgamated with the Indian peoples of those days, and remnants still persist among them. The southern nation entered Africa, where they destroyed their almost equally inferior orange cousins. In many ways, both groups were evenly matched in this struggle, since each carried strains of the giant order, many of their leaders being 8 and 9 feet in height. These giant strains of the green man were mostly confined to this southern or Egyptian nation. The remnants of the victorious green men were subsequently absorbed by the indigo race, the last of the colored peoples to develop and emigrate from the original Sangic center of race dispersion. 5. The blue man. The blue men were a great people. They early invented the spear and subsequently worked out the rudiments of many of the arts of modern civilization. The blue man had the brain power of the red man associated with the soul and sentiment of the yellow man. The Adamic descendants preferred them to all of the later persisting colored races. The early blue men were responsive to the persuasions of the teachers of Prince Caligastia's staff and were thrown into great confusion by the subsequent perverted teachings of those traitorous leaders. Like other primitive races, they never fully recovered from the turmoil produced by the Caligastia betrayal, nor did they ever completely overcome their tendency to fight among themselves. About 500 years after Caligastia's downfall, a widespread revival of learning and religion of a primitive sort, but nonetheless real and beneficial, occurred. Orlandolf became a great teacher among the blue race, and led many of the tribes back to the worship of the true God under the name of the Supreme Chief. This was the greatest advance of the blue man until those later times when this race was so greatly upstepped by the admixture of the Adamic stock. The European researches and explorations of the Old Stone Age have largely to do with unearthing the tools, bones, and art craft of these ancient blue men, for they persisted in Europe until recent times. The so-called white races of Urantia are the descendants of these blue men, as they were first modified by slight mixture with yellow and red, and as they were later greatly upstepped by assimilating the greater portion of the violet race. 6. The indigo race. As the red men were the most advanced of all the Sangic peoples, so the black men were the least progressive. They were the last to migrate from their highland homes. They journeyed to Africa, taking possession of the continent, and have ever since remained there, except when they have been forcibly taken away, from age to age, as slaves. Isolated in Africa, the indigo peoples, like the red man, receive little or none of the race elevation which would have been derived from the infusion of the Adamic stock. Alone in Africa, the indigo race made little advancement until the days of Orvanon, when they experienced a great spiritual awakening. While they later almost entirely forgot the God of gods proclaimed by Orvanon, they did not entirely lose the desire to worship the unknown. At least they maintained a form of worship up to a few thousand years ago. Notwithstanding their backwardness, these indigo peoples have exactly the same standing before the celestial powers as any other earthly race. These were ages of intense struggles between the various races, but near the headquarters of the planetary prince, the more enlightened and more recently taught groups lived together in comparative harmony. Though no great cultural conquest of the world races had been achieved up to the time of the serious disruption of this regime by the outbreak of the Lucifer Rebellion. From time to time, all of these different peoples experienced cultural and spiritual revivals. Mansant was a great teacher of the post-planetary prince days. But mention is made only of those outstanding leaders and teachers who markedly influenced and inspired a whole race. With the passing of time, many lesser teachers arose in different regions, and in the aggregate, they contributed much to the sum total of those saving influences which prevented the total collapse of cultural civilization, especially during the long and dark ages between the Caligastia Rebellion and the arrival of Adam. There are many good and sufficient reasons for the plan of evolving either 3 or 6 colored races on the worlds of space. Though Urantia mortals may not be in a position fully to appreciate all of these reasons, we would call attention to the following. 1. Variety is indispensable to opportunity for the wide functioning of natural selection, differential survival of superior strains. 2. Stronger and better races are to be had from the interbreeding of diverse peoples when these different races are carriers of superior inheritance factors, and the Urantia races would have benefited by such an early amalgamation, provided such a conjoint people could have been subsequently effectively upstepped by a thoroughgoing admixture with the superior Adamic stock. The attempt to execute such an experiment on Urantia under present racial conditions would be highly disastrous. 3. Competition is healthfully stimulated by diversification of races. 4. Differences in status of the races and of groups within each race are essential to the development of human tolerance and altruism. 5. Homogeneity of the human race is not desirable until the peoples of an evolving world attain comparatively high levels of spiritual development. 7. Dispersion of the colored races. When the colored descendants of the Sanghic family began to multiply, and as they sought opportunity for expansion into adjacent territory, the 5th glacier, the 3rd of geologic count, was well advanced on its southern drift over Europe and Asia. These early colored races were extraordinarily tested by the rigors and hardships of the glacial age of their origin. This glacier was so extensive in Asia that for thousands of years migration to eastern Asia was cut off, and not until the later retreat of the Mediterranean Sea, consequent upon the elevation of Arabia, was it possible for them to reach Africa. Thus it was that for almost 100,000 years these Sanghic peoples spread out around the foothills and mingled together more or less, notwithstanding the peculiar but natural antipathy which early manifested itself between the different races. Between the times of the planetary prince and Adam, India became the home of the most cosmopolitan population ever to be found on the face of the earth. But it was unfortunate that this mixture came to contain so much of the green, orange, and indigo races. These secondary Sanghic peoples found existence more easy and agreeable in the Southlands, and many of them subsequently migrated to Africa. The primary Sanghic peoples, the superior races, avoided the tropics, the red man going northeast to Asia, closely followed by the yellow man, while the blue race moved northwest into Europe. The red men early began to migrate to the northeast on the heels of the retreating ice, passing around the highlands of India and occupying all of northeastern Asia. They were closely followed by the yellow tribes, who subsequently drove them out of Asia into North America. When the relatively pure-line remnants of the red race forsook Asia, there were 11 tribes, and they numbered a little over 7,000 men, women, and children. These tribes were accompanied by 3 small groups of mixed ancestry, the largest of these being a combination of the orange and blue races. These three groups never fully fraternized with the red man and early journeyed southward to Mexico and Central America, where they were later joined by a small group of mixed yellows and reds. These peoples all intermarried and founded a new and amalgamated race, one which was much less warlike than the pure-line red men. Within 5,000 years, this amalgamated race broke up into three groups, establishing the civilizations respectively of Mexico, Central America, and South America. The South American offshoot did receive a faint touch of the blood of Adam. To a certain extent, the early red and yellow men mingled in Asia, and the offspring of this union journeyed on to the east and along the southern seacoast, and eventually were driven by the rapidly increasing yellow race onto the peninsulas and nearby islands of the sea. They are the present-day brown men. The yellow race has continued to occupy the central regions of Eastern Asia. Of all the six-colored races, they have survived in greatest numbers. While the yellow men now and then engaged in racial war, they did not carry on such incessant and relentless wars of extermination as were waged by the red, green, and orange men. These three races virtually destroyed themselves before they were finally all but annihilated by their enemies of other races. Since the fifth glacier did not extend so far south in Europe, the way was partially open for these Sangic peoples to migrate to the northwest, and upon the retreat of the ice, the blue men, together with a few other small racial groups, migrated westward along the old trails of the Andan tribes. They invaded Europe in successive waves, occupying most of the continent. In Europe, they soon encountered the Neanderthal descendants of their early and common ancestor, Andan. These older European Neanderthalers had been driven south and east by the glacier, and thus were in position quickly to encounter and absorb their invading cousins of the Sangic tribes. In general, and to start with, the Sangic tribes were more intelligent than, and in most ways far superior to, the deteriorated descendants of the early Andonic plainsmen, and the mingling of these Sangic tribes with the Neanderthal peoples led to the immediate improvement of the older race. It was this infusion of Sangic blood, more especially that of the blue man, which produced that marked improvement in the Neanderthal peoples exhibited by the successive waves of increasingly intelligent tribes that swept over Europe from the east. During the following interglacial period, this new Neanderthal race extended from England to India. The remnant of the blue race left in the old Persian peninsula later amalgamated with certain others, primarily the yellow, and the resultant blend, subsequently somewhat upstepped by the violet race of Adam, has persisted as the swarthy nomadic tribes of modern Arabs. All efforts to identify the Sangic ancestry of modern peoples must take into account the later improvement of the racial strains by the subsequent admixture of Adamic blood. The superior races sought the northern or temperate climes, while the orange, green, and indigo races successively gravitated to Africa over the newly elevated land bridge which separated the westward retreating Mediterranean from the Indian Ocean. The last of the Sangic peoples to migrate from their center of race origin was the Indigo man. About the time the Green man was killing off the orange race in Egypt and greatly weakening himself in so doing, the great black exodus started south through Palestine along the coast, and later, when these physically strong Indigo peoples overran Egypt, they wiped the Green man out of existence by sheer force of numbers. These indigo races absorbed the remnants of the orange man and much of the stock of the green man, and certain of the indigo tribes were considerably improved by this racial amalgamation. And so it appears that Egypt was first dominated by the orange man, then by the green, followed by the indigo, black man, and still later by a mongrel race of indigo, blue, and modified green men. But long before Adam arrived, the blue men of Europe and the mixed races of Arabia had driven the indigo race out of Egypt and far south on the African continent. As the Sangic migrations draw to a close, the green and orange races are gone. The red man holds North America, the yellow man Eastern Asia, the blue man Europe, and the indigo race has gravitated to Africa. India harbors a blend of the secondary Sangic races, and the brown man, a blend of the red and yellow, holds the islands off the Asiatic coast. An amalgamated race of rather superior potential occupies the highlands of South America. The purer Andinites live in the extreme northern regions of Europe and in Iceland, Greenland, and northeastern North America. During the periods of farthest glacial advance, the westernmost of the Andan tribes came very near being driven into the sea. They lived for years on a narrow southern strip of the present island of England, and it was the tradition of these repeated glacial advances that drove them to take to the sea when the sixth and last glacier finally appeared. They were the first marine adventurers. They built boats and started in search of new lands, which they hoped might be free from the terrifying ice invasions. And some of them reached Iceland, others Greenland, but the vast majority perished from hunger and thirst on the open sea. A little more than 80,000 years ago, shortly after the red man entered northwestern North America, the freezing over of the North Seas and the advance of local ice fields on Greenland drove these Eskimo descendants of the Urantia Aborigines to seek a better land, a new home, and they were successful, safely crossing the narrow straits which then separated Greenland from the northeastern landmasses of North America. They reached the continent about 2,100 years after the red man arrived in Alaska. Subsequently, some of the mixed stock of the blue man journeyed westward and amalgamated with the later-day Eskimos, and this union was slightly beneficial to the Eskimo tribes. About 5,000 years ago, a chance meeting occurred between an Indian tribe and a lone Eskimo group on the southeastern shores of Hudson Bay. These two tribes found it difficult to communicate with each other, but very soon they intermarried with the result that these Eskimos were eventually absorbed by the more numerous red men. And this represents the only contact of the North American red man with any other human stock down to about 1,000 years ago, when the white man first chanced to land on the Atlantic coast. The struggles of these early ages were characterized by courage, bravery, and even heroism, and we all regret that so many of those sterling and rugged traits of your early ancestors have been lost to the later-day races. While we appreciate the value of many of the refinements of advancing civilization, we miss the magnificent persistency and superb devotion of your early ancestors, which oftentimes bordered on grandeur and sublimity.
Presented by a life carrier, resident on Urantia.
Paper 65. The Overcontrol of Evolution. Basic evolutionary material life, pre-mind life, is the formulation of the master physical controllers and the life impartation ministry of the seven master spirits in conjunction with the active ministration of the ordained life carriers. As a result of the coordinate function of this threefold creativity, there develops organismal physical capacity for mind, material mechanisms for intelligent reaction to external environmental stimuli, and, later on, to internal stimuli, influences taking origin in the organismal mind itself. There are, then, three distinct levels of life production and evolution. 1. The physical energy domain, mind capacity production. 2. The mind ministry of the adjutant spirits, impinging upon spirit capacity. 3. The spirit endowment of mortal mind, culminating in thought adjuster bestowal. The mechanical non-teachable levels of organismal environmental response are the domains of the physical controllers. The adjutant mind spirits activate and regulate the adaptive or non-mechanical, teachable types of mind, those response mechanisms of organisms capable of learning from experience. And as the spirit adjutants thus manipulate mind potentials, so do the life carriers exercise considerable discretionary control over the environmental aspects of evolutionary processes right up to the time of the appearance of human will, the ability to know God and the power of choosing to worship Him. It is the integrated functioning of the life carriers, the physical controllers, and the spirit adjutants that conditions the course of organic evolution on the inhabited worlds. And this is why evolution, on Urantia or elsewhere, is always purposeful and never accidental. 1. Life carrier functions. The life carriers are endowed with potentials of personality metamorphosis which but few orders of creatures possess. These sons of the local universe are capable of functioning in 3 diverse phases of being. They ordinarily perform their duties as mid-phase sons, that being the state of their origin. But a life carrier in such a stage of existence could not possibly function in the electrochemical domains as a fabricator of physical energies and material particles into units of living existence. Life carriers are able to function and do function on the following 3 levels. 1. The physical level of electrochemistry. 2. The usual mid-phase of quasi-merantial existence. 3. The advanced semi-spiritual level. When the life carriers make ready to engage in life implantation, and after they have selected the sites for such an undertaking, they summon the Archangel Commission of Life Carrier Transmutation. This group consists of 10 orders of diverse personalities, including the physical controllers and their associates, and is presided over by the Chief of Archangels, who acts in this capacity by the mandate of Gabriel and with the permission of the Ancients of Days. When these beings are properly encircuited, they can effect such modifications in the life carriers as will enable them immediately to function on the physical levels of electrochemistry. After the life patterns have been formulated and the material organizations have been duly completed, the supermaterial forces concerned in life propagation become forthwith active, and life is existent. Whereupon the life carriers are immediately returned to their normal mid-phase of personality existence, in which state they can manipulate the living units and maneuver the evolving organisms, even though they are shorn of all ability to organize, create new patterns of living matter. After organic evolution has run a certain course and free will of the human type has appeared in the highest evolving organisms, the life carriers must either leave the planet or take renunciation vows. That is, they must pledge themselves to refrain from all attempts further to influence the course of organic evolution. And when such vows are voluntarily taken by those life carriers who choose to remain on the planet as future advisors to those who shall be entrusted with the fostering of the newly evolved will creatures, there is summoned a commission of 12, presided over by the chief of the evening stars, acting by authority of the system's sovereign and with permission of Gabriel. And forthwith these life carriers are transmuted to the 3rd phase of personality existence, the semi-spiritual level of being. And I have functioned on Urantia in this 3rd phase of existence ever since the times of Andan and Fanta. We look forward to a time when the universe may be settled in light and life, to a possible 4th stage of being, wherein we shall be wholly spiritual, but it has never been revealed to us by what technique we may attain this desirable and advanced estate. 2. The evolutionary panorama. The story of man's ascent from seaweed to the lordship of earthly creation is indeed a romance of biologic struggle and mind survival. Man's primordial ancestors were literally the slime and ooze of the ocean bed in the sluggish and warm water bays and lagoons of the vast shorelines of the ancient inland seas, those very waters in which the life carriers established the 3 independent life implantations on Urantia. Very few species of the early types of marine vegetation that participated in those epochal changes which resulted in the animal-like borderland organisms are in existence today. The sponges are the survivors of one of these early midway types, those organisms through which the gradual transition from the vegetable to the animal took place. These early transition forms, while not identical with modern sponges, were much like them. They were true borderline organisms, neither vegetable nor animal, but they eventually led to the development of the true animal forms of life. The bacteria, simple vegetable organisms of a very primitive nature, are very little changed from the early dawn of life. They even exhibit a degree of retrogression in their parasitic behavior. Many of the fungi also represent a retrograde movement in evolution, being plants which have lost their chlorophyll-making ability and have become more or less parasitic. The majority of disease-causing bacteria and their auxiliary virus bodies really belong to this group of renegade parasitic fungi. During the intervening ages, all of the vast kingdom of plant life has evolved from ancestors from which the bacteria have also descended. The higher protozoan type of animal life soon appeared, and appeared suddenly. And from these far distant times, the amoeba, the typical single-celled animal organism, has come on down but little modified. He disports himself today much as he did when he was the last and greatest achievement in life evolution. This minute creature and his protozoan cousins are to the animal creation what bacteria are to the plant kingdom. They represent the survival of the first early evolutionary steps in life differentiation together with failure of subsequent development. Before long, the early single-celled animal types associated themselves in communities, first on the plan of the volvox and presently along the lines of the hydra and jellyfish. Still later there evolved the starfish, stone lilies, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, centipedes, insects, spiders, crustaceans, and the closely related groups of earthworms and leeches, soon followed by the mollusks, the oyster, octopus, and snail. Hundreds upon hundreds of species intervened and perished. Mention is made only of those which survived the long, long struggle. Such non-progressive specimens, together with the later appearing fish family, today represent the stationary types of early and lower animals, branches of the tree of life which failed to progress. The stage was thus set for the appearance of the first backboned animals, the fishes. From this fish family there sprang 2 unique modifications, the frog and the salamander. And it was the frog which began that series of progressive differentiations in animal life that finally culminated in man himself. The frog is one of the earliest of surviving human race ancestors, but it also failed to progress, persisting today much as in those remote times. The frog is the only species ancestor of the early dawn races now living on the face of the earth. The human race has no surviving ancestry between the frog and the Eskimo. The frogs gave rise to the reptilia, a great animal family which is virtually extinct, but which, before passing out of existence, gave origin to the whole bird family and the numerous orders of mammals. Probably the greatest single leap of all pre-human evolution was executed when the reptile became a bird. The bird types of today, eagles, ducks, pigeons, and ostriches, all descended from the enormous reptiles of long, long ago. The kingdom of reptiles, descended from the frog family, is today represented by 4 surviving divisions: 2 non-progressive, snakes and lizards, together with their cousins, alligators and turtles, 1 partially progressive, the bird family, and the 4th, the ancestors of mammals and the direct line of descent of the human species. But though long departed, the massiveness of the passing reptilia found echo in the elephant and mastodon, while their peculiar forms were perpetuated in the leaping kangaroos. Only 14 phyla have appeared on Urantia, the fishes being the last, and no new classes have developed since birds and mammals. It was from an agile little reptilian dinosaur of carnivorous habits but having a comparatively large brain that the placental mammals suddenly sprang. These mammals developed rapidly and in many different ways, not only giving rise to the common modern varieties, but also evolving into marine types, such as whales and seals, and into air navigators like the bat family. Man thus evolved from the higher mammals derived principally from the western implantation of life in the ancient east-west sheltered seas. The eastern and central groups of living organisms were early progressing favorably toward the attainment of pre-human levels of animal existence. But as the ages passed, the eastern focus of life emplacement failed to attain a satisfactory level of intelligent pre-human status, having suffered such repeated and irretrievable losses of its highest types of germplasm that it was forever shorn of the power to rehabilitate human potentialities. Since the quality of the mind capacity for development in this eastern group was so definitely inferior to that of the other 2 groups, the life carriers, with the consent of their superiors, so manipulated the environment as further to circumscribe these inferior pre-human strains of evolving life. To all outward appearances, the elimination of these inferior groups of creatures was accidental, but in reality it was altogether purposeful. Later in the evolutionary unfolding of intelligence, the lemur ancestors of the human species were far more advanced in North America than in other regions, and they were therefore led to migrate from the arena of Western life implantation over the Bering Land Bridge and down the coast to southwestern Asia, where they continued to evolve and to benefit by the addition of certain strains of the central life group. Man thus evolved out of certain Western and Central life strains, but in the Central to Near Eastern regions. In this way, the life that was planted on Urantia evolved until the Ice Age, when man himself first appeared and began his eventful planetary career. And this appearance of primitive man on Earth during the Ice Age was not just an accident. It was by design. The rigors and climatic severity of the glacial era were in every way adapted to the purpose of fostering the production of a hardy type of human being with tremendous survival endowment. 3. The fostering of evolution. It will hardly be possible to explain to the present-day human mind many of the queer and apparently grotesque occurrences of early evolutionary progress. A purposeful plan was functioning throughout all of these seemingly strange evolutions of living things, but we are not allowed arbitrarily to interfere with the development of the life patterns after they have once been set in operation. Life carriers may employ every possible natural resource and may utilize any and all fortuitous circumstances which will enhance the developmental progress of the life experiment. But we are not permitted mechanically to intervene in or arbitrarily to manipulate the conduct and course of either plant or animal evolution. You have been informed that Urantia mortals evolved by way of primitive frog development, and that this ascending strain, carried in potential in a single frog, narrowly escaped extinction on a certain occasion. But it should not be inferred that the evolution of mankind would have been terminated by an accident at this juncture. At that very moment, we were observing and fostering no less than 1,000 different and remotely situated, mutating strains of life, which could have been directed into various different patterns of pre-human development. This particular ancestral frog represented our third selection, the 2 prior life strains having perished in spite of all our efforts toward their conservation. Even the loss of Andan infanta before they had offspring, though delaying human evolution, would not have prevented it. Subsequent to the appearance of Andan infanta, and before the mutating human potentials of animal life were exhausted, there evolved no less than 7,000 favorable strains which could have achieved some sort of human type of development. And many of these better stocks were subsequently assimilated by the various branches of the expanding human species. Long before the material son and daughter, the biologic uplifters, arrive on a planet, the human potentials of the evolving animal species have been exhausted. This biologic status of animal life is disclosed to the life carriers by the phenomenon of the 3rd phase of adjutant spirit mobilization, which automatically occurs concomitantly with the exhaustion of the capacity of all animal life to give origin to the mutant potentials of pre-human individuals. Mankind on Urantia must solve its problems of mortal development with the human stocks it has. No more races will evolve from pre-human sources throughout all future time. But this fact does not preclude the possibility of the attainment of vastly higher levels of human development through the intelligent fostering of the evolutionary potentials still resident in the mortal races. That which we, the life carriers, do toward fostering and conserving the life strains before the appearance of human will, man must do for himself after such an event, and subsequent to our retirement from active participation in evolution. In a general way, man's evolutionary destiny is in his own hands, and scientific intelligence must sooner or later supersede the random functioning of uncontrolled natural selection and chance survival. And in discussing the fostering of evolution, it would not be amiss to point out that, in the long future ahead, when you may sometime be attached to a corps of life carriers, you will have abundant and ample opportunity to offer suggestions and make any possible improvements in the plans and technique of life management and transplantation. Be patient. If you have good ideas, if your minds are fertile with better methods of administration for any part of the universal domains, you are certainly going to have an opportunity to present them to your associates and fellow administrators in the ages to come. 4. The Urantia Adventure. Do not overlook the fact that Urantia was assigned to us as a life experiment world. On this planet we made our 60th attempt to modify and, if possible, improve the Satania adaptation of the Nebadon life designs, and it is of record that we achieved numerous beneficial modifications of the standard life patterns. To be specific, on Urantia we worked out and have satisfactorily demonstrated not less than 28 features of life modification which will be of service to all Nebadon throughout all future time. But the establishment of life on no world is ever experimental in the sense that something untried and unknown is attempted. The evolution of life is a technique ever progressive, differential, and variable, but never haphazard, uncontrolled, nor wholly experimental in the accidental sense. Many features of human life afford abundant evidence that the phenomenon of mortal existence was intelligently planned, that organic evolution is not a mere cosmic accident. When a living cell is injured, it possesses the ability to elaborate certain chemical substances which are empowered so to stimulate and activate the neighboring normal cells that they immediately begin the secretion of certain substances which facilitate healing processes in the wound. And at the same time, these normal and uninjured cells begin to proliferate. They actually start to work creating new cells to replace any fellow cells which may have been destroyed by the accident. This chemical action and reaction concerned in wound healing and cell reproduction represents the choice of the life carriers of a formula embracing over 100,000 phases and features of possible chemical reactions and biologic repercussions. more than 500,000 specific experiments were made by the life carriers in their laboratories before they finally settled upon this formula for the Urantia life experiment. When Urantia scientists know more of these healing chemicals, they will become more efficient in the treatment of injuries, and indirectly they will know more about controlling certain serious diseases. Since life was established on Urantia, the life carriers have improved this healing technique as it has been introduced on another Satania world, in that it affords more pain relief and exercises better control over the proliferation capacity of the associated normal cells. There were many unique features of the Urantia life experiment, but the two outstanding episodes were the appearance of the Andonic race prior to the evolution of the 6 colored peoples, and the later simultaneous appearance of the Sangic mutants in a single family. Urantia is the first world in Satania where the 6 colored races sprang from the same human family. They ordinarily arise in diversified strains from independent mutations within the pre-human animal stock, and usually appear on Earth one at a time and successively over long periods of time, beginning with the red man and passing on down through the colors to indigo. Another outstanding variation of procedure was the late arrival of the planetary prince. As a rule, the prince appears on a planet about the time of will development, and if such a plan had been followed, Caligastia might have come to Urantia even during the lifetimes of Andon and Fanta instead of almost 500,000 years later, simultaneously with the appearance of the 6 Sangic races. On an ordinary inhabited world, a planetary prince would have been granted on the request of the life carriers at or sometime after the appearance of Andon and Fanta. But Urantia having been designated a life modification planet, it was by prearrangement that the Melchizedek observers, 12 in number, were sent as advisors to the life carriers and as overseers of the planet until the subsequent arrival of the planetary prince. These Melchizedeks came at the time Andon and Fanta made the decisions which enabled thought adjusters to indwell their mortal minds. On Urantia, the endeavors of the life carriers to improve the Satania life patterns necessarily resulted in the production of many apparently useless forms of transition life. But the gains already accrued are sufficient to justify the Urantia modifications of the standard life designs. It was our intention to produce an early manifestation of will in the evolutionary life of Urantia, and we succeeded. Ordinarily, will does not emerge until the colored races have long been in existence, usually first appearing among the superior types of the red man. Your world is the only planet in Satania where the human type of will has appeared in a pre-colored race. But in our effort to provide for that combination and association of inheritance factors which finally gave rise to the mammalian ancestors of the human race, we were confronted with the necessity of permitting hundreds and thousands of other and comparatively useless combinations and associations of inheritance factors to take place. Many of these seemingly strange byproducts of our efforts are certain to meet your gaze as you dig back into the planetary past, and I can well understand how puzzling some of these things must be to the limited human viewpoint. 5. Life Evolution Vicissitudes. It was a source of regret to the life carriers that our special efforts to modify intelligent life on Urantia should have been so handicapped by tragic perversions beyond our control, the Caligastia betrayal and the Adamic default. But throughout all of this biologic adventure, our greatest disappointment grew out of the reversion of certain primitive plant life to the pre-chlorophyll levels of parasitic bacteria on such an extensive and unexpected scale. This eventuality in plant life evolution caused many distressful diseases in the higher mammals, particularly in the more vulnerable human species. When we were confronted with this perplexing situation, We somewhat discounted the difficulties involved because we knew that the subsequent admixture of the Adamic life plasm would so reinforce the resisting powers of the resulting blended race as to make it practically immune to all diseases produced by the vegetable type of organism. But our hopes were doomed to disappointment owing to the misfortune of the Adamic default. The universe of universes, including this small world called Urantia, is not being managed merely to meet our approval nor just to suit our convenience, much less to gratify our whims and satisfy our curiosity. The wise and all-powerful beings who are responsible for universe management undoubtedly know exactly what they are about, and so it becomes life carriers, and behooves mortal minds to enlist in patient waiting and hearty cooperation with the rule of wisdom, the reign of power, and the march of progress. There are, of course, certain compensations for tribulation, such as Michael's bestowal on Urantia. But, irrespective of all such considerations, the later celestial supervisors of this planet express complete confidence in the ultimate evolutionary triumph of the human race and in the eventual vindication of our original plans and life patterns. 6. Evolutionary techniques of life. It is impossible accurately to determine simultaneously the exact location and the velocity of a moving object. Any attempt at measurement of either inevitably involves change in the other. The same sort of a paradox confronts mortal man when he undertakes the chemical analysis of protoplasm. The chemist can elucidate the chemistry of dead protoplasm, but he cannot discern either the physical organization or the dynamic performance of living protoplasm. Ever will the scientist come nearer and nearer the secrets of life, but never will he find them, and for no other reason than that he must kill protoplasm in order to analyze it. Dead protoplasm weighs the same as living protoplasm, but it is not the same. There is original endowment of adaptation in living things and beings. In every living plant or animal cell, in every living organism, material or spiritual, there is an insatiable craving for the attainment of ever-increasing perfection of environmental adjustment, organismal adaptation, and augmented life realization. These interminable efforts of all living things evidence the existence within them of an innate striving for perfection. The most important step in plant evolution was the development of chlorophyll-making ability, and the second greatest advance was the evolution of the spore into the complex seed. The spore is most efficient as a reproductive agent, but it lacks the potentials of variety and versatility inherent in the seed. One of the most serviceable and complex episodes in the evolution of the higher types of animals consisted in the development of the ability of the iron in the circulating blood cells to perform in the double role of oxygen carrier and carbon dioxide remover. And this performance of the red blood cells illustrates how evolving organisms are able to adapt their functions to varying or changing environment. The higher animals, including man, oxygenate their tissues by the action of the iron of the red blood cells, which carries oxygen to the living cells and just as efficiently removes the carbon dioxide. But other metals can be made to serve the same purpose. The cuttlefish employs copper for this function, and the sea squirt utilizes vanadium. The continuation of such biologic adjustments is illustrated by the evolution of teeth in the higher Urantia mammals. These attained to 36 in man's remote ancestors, and then began an adaptive readjustment toward 32 in the dawn man and his near relatives. Now the human species is slowly gravitating toward 28. The process of evolution is still actively and adaptatively in progress on this planet. But many seemingly mysterious adjustments of living organisms are purely chemical, wholly physical. At any moment of time, in the bloodstream of any human being, there exists the possibility of upward of 15 million chemical reactions between the hormone output of a dozen ductless glands. The lower forms of plant life are wholly responsive to physical, chemical, and electrical environment. But as the scale of life ascends, one by one the mind ministries of the 7 adjutant spirits become operative, and the mind becomes increasingly adjustive, creative, coordinative, and dominative. The ability of animals to adapt themselves to air, water, and land is not a supernatural endowment, but it is a superphysical adjustment. Physics and chemistry alone cannot explain how a human being evolved out of the primeval protoplasm of the early seas. The ability to learn, memory, and differential response to environment is the endowment of mind. The laws of physics are not responsive to training. They are immutable and unchanging. The reactions of chemistry are not modified by education. They are uniform and dependable. Aside from the presence of the unqualified absolute, electrical and chemical reactions are predictable. But mind can profit from experience, can learn from reactive habits of behavior in response to repetition of stimuli. Pre-intelligent organisms react to environmental stimuli, but those organisms which are reactive to mind ministry can adjust and manipulate the environment itself. The physical brain, with its associated nervous system, possesses innate capacity for response to mind ministry, just as the developing mind of a personality possesses a certain innate capacity for spirit receptivity, and therefore contains the potentials of spiritual progress and attainment. Intellectual, social, moral, and spiritual evolution are dependent on the mind ministry of the 7 adjutant spirits and their superphysical associates. 7. Evolutionary mind levels. The 7 adjutant mind spirits are the versatile mind ministers to the lower intelligent existences of a local universe. This order of mind is ministered from the local universe headquarters or from some world connected therewith, but there is influential direction of lower mind function from the system capitals. On an evolutionary world, much, very much, depends on the work of these 7 adjutants. But they are mind ministers. They are not concerned in physical evolution, the domain of the life carriers. Nevertheless, the perfect integration of these spirit endowments with the ordained and natural procedure of the unfolding and inherent regime of the life carriers is responsible for the mortal inability to discern, in the phenomenon of mind, aught but the hand of nature and the outworking of natural processes, albeit you are occasionally somewhat perplexed in explaining all of everything connected with the natural reactions of mind as it is associated with matter. And if Urantia were operating more in accordance with the original plans, you would observe even less to arrest your attention in the phenomenon of mind. The 7 adjutant spirits are more circuit-like than entity-like, and on ordinary worlds they are encircuited with other adjutant functionings throughout the local universe. On life experiment planets, however, they are relatively isolated, and on Urantia, owing to the unique nature of the life patterns, the lower adjutants experienced far more difficulty in contacting with the evolutionary organisms than would have been the case in a more standardized type of life endowment. Again, on an average evolutionary world, the 7 adjutant spirits are far better synchronized with the advancing stages of animal development than they were on Urantia. With but a single exception, the adjutants experienced the greatest difficulty in contacting with the evolving minds of Urantia organisms that they had ever had in all their functioning throughout the universe of Nebadon. On this world there developed many forms of border phenomena, confusional combinations of the mechanical, non-teachable, and the non-mechanical, teachable types of organismal response. The 7 adjutant spirits do not make contact with the purely mechanical orders of organismal environmental response. Such pre-intelligent responses of living organisms pertain purely to the energy domains of the power centers, the physical controllers, and their associates. The acquisition of the potential of the ability to learn from experience marks the beginning of the functioning of the adjutant spirits, and they function from the lowliest minds of primitive and invisible existences up to the highest types in the evolutionary scale of human beings. They are the source and pattern for the otherwise more or less mysterious behavior and incompletely understood quick reactions of mind to the material environment. Long must these faithful and always dependable influences carry forward their preliminary ministry before the animal mind attains the human levels of spirit receptivity. The adjutants function exclusively in the evolution of experiencing mind up to the level of the 6th phase, the spirit of worship. At this level there occurs that inevitable overlapping of ministry, the phenomenon of the higher reaching down to coordinate with the lower in anticipation of subsequent attainment of advanced levels of development. And still additional spirit ministry accompanies the action of the 7th and last adjutant, the spirit of wisdom. Throughout the ministry of the spirit world, the individual never experiences abrupt transitions of spirit cooperation. Always are these changes gradual and reciprocal. Always should the domains of the physical, electrochemical, and the mental response to environmental stimuli be differentiated, and in turn must they all be recognized as phenomena apart from spiritual activities. The domains of physical, mental, and spiritual gravity are distinct realms of cosmic reality, notwithstanding their intimate interrelations. 8. Evolution in time and space. Time and space are indissolubly linked. There is an innate association. The delays of time are inevitable in the presence of certain space conditions. If spending so much time in effecting the evolutionary changes of life development occasions perplexity, I would say that we cannot time the life processes to unfold any faster than the physical metamorphoses of a planet will permit. We must wait upon the natural, physical development of a planet. We have absolutely no control over geologic evolution. If the physical conditions would allow, we could arrange for the completed evolution of life in considerably less than 1 million years. But we are all under the jurisdiction of the supreme rulers of paradise, and time is non-existent on paradise. The individual's yardstick for time measurement is the length of his life. All creatures are thus time-conditioned, and therefore do they regard evolution as being a long, drawn-out process. To those of us whose lifespan is not limited by a temporal existence, evolution does not seem to be such a protracted transaction. On paradise, where time is non-existent, these things are all present in the mind of infinity and the acts of eternity. As mind evolution is dependent on and delayed by the slow development of physical conditions, so is spiritual progress dependent on mental expansion and unfailingly delayed by intellectual retardation. But this does not mean that spiritual evolution is dependent on education, culture, or wisdom. The soul may evolve regardless of mental culture, but not in the absence of mental capacity and desire. The choice of survival and the decision to achieve ever-increasing perfection, to do the will of the Father in heaven. Although survival may not depend on the possession of knowledge and wisdom, progression most certainly does. In the cosmic evolutionary laboratories, mind is always dominant over matter, and spirit is ever correlated with mind. Failure of these diverse endowments to synchronize and coordinate may cause time delays, but if the individual really knows God and desires to find Him and become like Him, then survival is assured regardless of the handicaps of time. Physical status may handicap mind, and mental perversity may delay spiritual attainment, but none of these obstacles can defeat the whole-souled choice of will. When physical conditions are ripe, sudden mental evolutions may take place. When mind status is propitious, sudden spiritual transformations may occur. When spiritual values receive proper recognition, then cosmic meanings become discernible, and increasingly the personality is released from the handicaps of time and delivered from the limitations of space.
Sponsored by a life carrier of Nebadon, resident on Urantia.